Hello everyone, my name is Moosa. I'm the curator of the Reclaiming Power, Women and Intersecting Inequalities exhibition, inspired by the Oxfam South Africa Inequality Report. We're here in Newtown, Johannesburg at the Workers' Museum. Hope you enjoy the show. So this room speaks particularly to the foundations of how our economy has been built in South Africa, the foundations of it all. It speaks to the different movements that have existed to challenge the way that this economy has been structured. It speaks to how women have been fighting over the years to challenge the way that the minerals and energy complex has made it difficult for them to work. It speaks to how minors have been treated along the years. It speaks to how the Women's Charter was actually founded before the Freedom Charter, but it's been minimized and it hasn't been recognized over the years. We have over here a work called the Charter by Msezane, which is a response to all of the work that has been done in terms of activism, in terms of making sure that people understand that all the promises that were made in this charter haven't been actually fulfilled. So this is quite an interesting space here. What we also have is some quotes over here that are actually from the report. So we see here, for example, South Africa's economy is dominated by large-scale mining, minerals energy production, which supports mining such as Sasol and Eskom, as well as the financial sector. So what this has meant for a lot of women is that their needs haven't been taken into account, especially black women. And we've seen a black labor system that exists that's been really reliant or mainly reliant on cheap labor. And women have been fighting against that for many, many years. So this space is really in honor of that. Just figuring out where we come from, how we got into this particular position, and trying to figure out a way forward.
The MEC stands for the Minerals Energy Complex. And it was put forward by Zavera Rustamji and Ben Fine in the early 90s, who came up with the idea to help us understand how economic development occurred from the latter part of the 19th century and through apartheid. The MEC is an analysis of the industrial development that focuses on interdependencies of different powerful groups in society, between different industrial sectors and with the state. There are several ways in which the MEC industrial structure can impact on economic and gender inequality. The first is in terms of employment. So MEC sectors are highly capital intensive. That means they have, in terms of output, they have a lot of machines and very few workers. So MEC sectors don't generate a lot of new employment when they grow. This was recognised during apartheid, and there was a lot of state support for labour-intensive economic activities, and as well as support for access to land to ensure low white unemployment. But unemployment did rise in the late apartheid period, as economic sanctions and political uncertainty meant that capitalists didn't want to invest in productive activities outside of the MEC. So rather than invest in production or manufacturing, money was channeled into the financial sector. In terms of gender inequality, jobs in the MEC tend to be better paid than in other sectors, and these jobs were traditionally and continue to be occupied by men in the main. So in 1994, the South African economy was heavily skewed. MEC sectors dominated the economy. Labour-intensive sectors like textiles, that were already in decline, were further decimated when they were exposed to competition from overseas. These sectors historically employed mainly women on their shop floors. Wage inequality in South Africa between men and women stemmed largely from differences in wages across occupations and skill, with women's employment concentrated in low-wage activities, such as domestic work. There was also a very concentrated pattern of ownership that developed under apartheid. So in 1994, the six large conglomerates controlled the vast majority of economic activity, In fact, in 1988, they collectively owned 83% of the stock market. So profit and wealth was heavily concentrated in the hands of a very small white elite. There were major transformations that were taking place at the level of the world economy. In the 1990s, we saw a wave of mergers and acquisitions across the US, UK and much of Europe, as multinational corporations consolidated their ownership and control. This period was also marked by corporate restructuring that was informed by a process referred to as downsize and distribute. So corporations were stripping away what they saw as non-core activities to be outsourced and focused then on what they called core competencies in order to maximize the returns to their shareholders. So in this way, the success of a corporation was now evaluated by the value of its shares and not necessarily how productive it's been in producing and employment and investment. Part of this has also involved the proliferation of global value chains as multinational firms outsourced production and other non-core activities to low-cost suppliers. It's also a context of highly mobile international capital that was flowing across national boundaries, finding for short-term high returns. So finance and financial markets became the sort of dominant institutions in economic activities and also key sites for the amassing of wealth. So in this context, the South African economy emerged from apartheid and opened up. We've already said something about the financial sector in South Africa that had grown in the 1980s because of sort of the sanctions trapping capital within the national boundaries. Now, this previously trapped capital was eager to internationalise and profit from this new financialised accumulation and the wealth that could be amassed on financial markets internationally. There was also an abundance of financial assets and a highly sophisticated financial sector in South Africa, focused in Johannesburg, that could profit from highly mobile international capital. So it's in this context that economic policies were being made from 1994. So in 1996, the South African government adopts GEAR, and the policies under GEAR were very much in the interest of conglomerate capital. This included things like high interest rates and controlled inflation that supported globalization and financialization of the South African economy. So these policies enriched finance and conglomerate capital, but they hurt workers because they involved keeping wages down, cutting government spending, and reducing government debt. There was also an absence of industrial policy except for in the motor industry. And there was an inadequate support for the clothing and textiles sectors, and that meant manufacturing outside of the MEC was very hard hit. And you get a pattern of deindustrialization that affected sectors outside of the MEC core. So these were labour-intensive sectors, where those who were mostly laid off were women and as well who bore the brunt of these. Further, the recession that was sparked by the global financial crisis in 2007-8 hit labour-intensive manufacturing particularly hard, and we saw masses of job losses again in that period. But at the same time, except for a little blip in the financial crisis, finance has been booming. This has driven asset price inflation. Property values have soared, as have many financial assets. And since the distribution of assets in South Africa is so heavily skewed and very much concentrated amongst the top 5 to 10%, these price increases have driven extreme wealth inequality. Booming finance has also made investors more short-term in their allocation of funds, preferring to channel funds into financial markets rather than invest in job-creating productive activities. And by limiting the expansion of jobs that are secure and relatively well paid in so-called low and semi-skilled activities, such as in labour-intensive manufacturing, the structure of the economy might also affect both the racial and gendered pattern of employment. women are much more likely to be employed in low-wage service sector jobs in private households, community and social services. And these are also the sectors with worsening precarity, where women are disproportionately affected. Women are also underrepresented in relatively more secure and well-paid jobs in manufacturing and finance. And there is, in general, an underrepresentation of women in occupations that are higher waged and higher skilled. So it is in this way that I wanted to say something about how, the legacy of apartheid industrial development and the economic structure that has sort of come out of that has opened up in the context of a financialized accumulation of the global economy, has really reproduced and created these and entrenched these dynamics of inequality, particularly through unemployment and patterns of unemployment, as well as patterns of employment according to skill and wage that have disproportionately affected black workers and in particular black women.
A part of the report actually mentions that a lot of precarious workers have found themselves becoming more ill over the years. And this is mainly because of the type of work that they're doing as night shift workers. So this installation over here is in honor of a lot of the women who have actually passed on as a result of having breast cancer. And the report actually says that a few companies take into account the safety of women workers in getting to work and home again, but night shift workers particularly are at risk when they're traveling in the dark, or they may end up sleeping on cardboard at work until the sun rises, which is also bad for their health. So medical studies prove that women shift workers are most likely to contract breast cancer. So this work really wanted to emphasize that part of the report to show that women are dying out there, and a lot of people haven't been cognizant of some of the issues that precarious workers are facing in the different type of work environments that they have. Ushintsho is a campaign that has been led by Oxfam South Africa as well as other allies in the social justice sector or civil society. And what they've been able to do is actually help community members realize the rights that they have towards the land that they live on, to ensure that they can safeguard those rights, to actually know that they can share their grievances that they have in terms of mining companies who actually want to come and mine on the land that they live on. So mining affected communities are able to share their grievances. It's actually an app that has been developed that is still in construction as well, which people can actually use to deal with or to put their grievances forward, whatever concerns they have forward. So it's quite an interesting work. We have a video that is a video installation that is playing here, and it actually documents some of the experiences of people who are living in certain communities, and it shows how they have been dealing with the different mining companies, challenging them, even though some of them have been killed along the way, some of them have their lives being threatened, and it's quite interesting, it's quite powerful, and it's an important conversation that we do need to have.
The Strengthening Rural Democracy project is an outcome of work that AFRA has been doing with people living and working on farms in the Umgungundlovu district. When we gathered farm dwellers and farm workers together last year after a series of local workshops where they were informed about their rights, they expressed a desire for their own vision of the future to be taken forward by themselves. It was at that point that AFRA was very generously assisted by Oxfam South Africa to allow farm dwellers and farm workers to take that opportunity through this project.
Unkulu yami yonke ningize ngifike la eJoburg. Unkulu yami ngizoyiqala efama la sasikakhe khona kwakwakhe khona ugogo nomkhulu wazala bomama bethu. lena ngasakhe khona indawo yakhona amafama idolobha lakhona kwakuwumnambithi idolobha lakhona kwakuwumnambithi kodwa ngamafama enkalweni different farmers but kuleyo ndawo ngoba phela kwangakho la ukuthi kuselokishini kwakufanele uhlale endaweni omunye umlungu ube umuntu osebenzela ukwakha umuzi ngoba ukhula khona la ufanele nawe futhi masukhulile uyosebenza eplaza yebo mina nami ngakhula ke masesengikhulile lapho ngayosebenza eplaza mina namani bancane ninemsebenzi le elayithinyana efana emncanyana ko abanye njalo bagada abantwana qala phela sasingabizi ukuthi abelungu umshadikazi womnikazi wefama kwakuwunona owami umsebenzi kwakuwugada amatswele kodwa small chicken umsebenzi wami we-small chicken engangosebenza kulelo bhuku mawubona ukuthi usuwonile akakubonisi ukuthi uzokupanisha kanjani uzokushaya kanjani yazi wayenzani yikho-ke lapho kwafika khona yikho-ke wawungakwazi ukuthi wena umntwana uye esikoleni ngaleso sikhathi ngoba mawukhula ukhulelani kuyoncedisa phi efama ngenina angizange angitshela unona ukuthi uhlelani wakunikeza ibhaskithi kule bhaskithi kokunebhotela ulifake esitsheni sakho angithi vele kuyasengwa kuphehla ubisi kuphehlwa amabhotela alifake esitsheni esikahle alivale kahle alifake indwangu emhlophe abhala incwadi mayeyibhala ayifake la envelopini ayifake la yathi kuwe gijima usele uyekama uyonikeza ukopolo phela umuntu onephandleni ukopolo wekama lo ufaka zonke izinto lezi hamba nikeza ukopolo wekama vele uzomthola usayitsheni omkhulu angithi usayitsheni omkhulu uzomthola kukude kama fika ukuthi uthe unona nginikeze ukopolo wekama usayitsheni omkhulu umnikeze memnikeza uzothatha ukopolo usayitsheni omkhulu wekama uzofunda kubheke bese athatha ibhotela athatha ibhaskithi angene e-ofisini lakhe wena uthathwe ufakwe uvalelwe masuvaleliwe uzohlala awazi ukuthi wena uvalelwe e-police station ethi angithi uzazi unganacala uhlala bazoyihlalela kuthi mase kuthanda bona bavule ekama labakuvalele khona uphi base bekubuza bathi why udelela unona angisanga nimdelele mina unona wena ulalela unona ngiyamlalela mina unona bakusela kushola khona ulaliswe phansi ushaywe ebunu noma ushaya amalantshisi amathathu noma ushaya amalantshisi awu-4 uphinde futhi bhala incwadi ifakwe kule athathe ubhotela bese kufakela incwadi phakathi gijima uyise kunona uyafuthelwa ngapha uhamba ukhala ngendlela kodwa makufanele ugijime ugijime ufika laphana ufike futhi ufike nentambama sokuntambama noma kunini ufike uthi the ukopolo ngokunikeze nayibhaskidi nayincwadi ayithathe-ke manje ayifunda athi nona ukulungisile uyangidelela ngilaleli phinde futhi ungangilaleli ngizobuyela futhi ekhaya akushaya ngathi mangikhula mangihleli ngiyi-1 ngathi mina angeke ngisebenze umlungu mase sisedanawosi ugogo amakhulu nathathu umuntu owashona kuqala umkhulu edanawosi mase sisedanawosi lana ngathi angeke ngisebenze umlungu mina mangikhula ngoba ngishayiwe
ngayobuhlungu
hayi mthule mama abasasebenzi-ke manje abasasebenzi manje eplazini sesisemakholweni sesisedanawosi bahleli lapho mama nangu-ke lapha esefundela naye umsebenzi emakhishini kodwa ngaleso sikhathi kwakuthafu ukuthi ungumama utholakala usebenze eGoli awunganapasa ngithi so noma usebenza kwamlungu loyo ozokuthatha wawumuntu ohlala ufihliwe hayi-ke umama wasebenza lapha emakhishini kwashona nogogo bayishona babeshona kwakhosta ukuthi nami ngize ngapha lokhuzana yilapho-ke umama wayefuthi sengimdala phela ngiyinkulunkulu ekade ngayanga esikolweni ngoba sikhulela emaplazini sikhulela ukusebenzela eplazini yila umama athi ngithi ngokufunele umsebenzi nawe emakhishini ngoba uyakwazi ukusebenza eplazini ungasebenza la emakhishini ngathi mama mina ngiyamsaba uzongishaya ngithi mina ngikhule kwazi ukuthi umlungu uyakushaya nje uyakushaya kungabi nalutho ngiyabasaba mina sekudala yabona ukuthengisa I'm sure mina angizange ngiqale ngokuthengisela mina ngibe yi-street vendor ngaqala ngathengisela ugogo wami sisedanawosi ngoba lapha nasasakhe khona kwaku endaweni zabantu and then lapha kwakunestarfan lapha yana kwakusekuqala ingathi nje abantu bayayiphilela so ugogo mayeqokelele imali yakhe uthengisa nami ngaqala ngathengisela ugogo ngathengisela umama ngaze ngasithengisela nomndeni wami that's why ngithi mina ngiqale kudala kodwa sengiyithengisela mina njengoba ngisahleli lapha ku-street trader eJubetan president lapha itafula lami ase ngisikhulisela mina why ngingazange ngifuna ukuyasebenza ngathi angeke ngize mina ngisebenze kumlungu ngoba wakushaya kakhulu umlungu eplazini but ngiyabonga inkulu nogogo ubekezela ugogo nokusebenza nje nokuphatha ngoba kwangenza ukuthi nami ngikhona ukukhulisa
ukhona So we've just had a very interesting chat with Umam Dade, and transitioning from that conversation, we'd like to find out a bit more about other forms of dispossession, the other side of the story which we don't really know much about, besides just physical dispossession of land, dispossession by the markets, for instance.
This issue of dispossession through the market is a very important one because when we think of apartheid, when we think of the restrictions and the inequalities that it created, we think primarily of direct dispossession, land dispossession. But there was also a lot of indirect dispossession through the market. To take the example of land dispossession, the Land Act in 1913 restricted ownership outside of the reserves, but it also restricted the transfer of land within the reserves. So one thing that it did is it prevented successful farmers from gaining more land and expanding their enterprise and becoming successful commercial farmers. So this kind of restrictions on the market prevented the development of an independent commercial farming class and kept people in the reserves at very low levels of subsistence, and with the goal obviously of forcing them to be migrant laborers for the large enterprises in the cities, the mines, and the industries. And I think, so one aspect, or one sector that was still open to black people, to poor people, and to black women in particular, was retail trade, because commercial farming was sort of closed off, and so there were these opportunities for retail trade. But there were also all sorts of market restrictions that prevented the development of an independent commercial class among black urban residents and black women in particular. So the kind of classic example is beer brewing, right? Because beer brewing is a low capital, low investment industry. It's easy to enter into, and it was one of the primary industries that women in urban areas, black women in urban areas, entered into. But it's one where all sorts of restrictions were put in place to limit the development of independent producers. Limit black women from becoming independent producers. So in Johannesburg, where we are, there was a municipal monopoly on selling traditional beer or sorghum beer to African consumers. And so this thing, which was the main source of employment for black women, they were legally restricted from doing it, and there was a legal monopoly of municipal beer halls which sold beer to workers. And the women who did try and manage to do this trade, faced constant repression and arrest and confiscation of their goods. And so it remained, people were resilient, and it remained an industry that women were involved in. But it's one where the opportunities for growth and expansion and establishing a secure, independent economic base were very limited. So we have this legacy of market inequality, which reinforces the inequality between classes and races and genders in South Africa. So I think that's a good example of the way the market was used. It wasn't, especially after the 1960s, it wasn't direct dispossession. It's not that people were told you can't have this business, but if they wanted to have the business, they're competing against a large multinational corporation that has had a long history of support from the state and protection from the state to allow it to get to that position. So you have this unfair market competition which keeps people in a sort of marginalized position in the same way that land dispossession did. So it's not to say that the direct dispossession was not important, but that these were the sort of two hands of dispossession. Direct expropriation of land, and indirect sort of tilting of the balance, the playing field against small producers.
Do you have an example of a more recent type that you can give us, maybe?
Yeah.
That we can think of.
Yeah. So the reason I think it's important to highlight this market aspect, or market form of dispossession, is that after 1994 we have the end of apartheid, we have the end of the explicitly racist, explicitly inequality in the law. But we still have this unequal market, which continues to make an unequal sort of playing field for people trying to establish economic independence, right? So we have the story is not even a different story, it's the same story that continues. We have not addressed that market inequality which strongly advantages large producers over small producers. So it's a reason that we have actually a relatively small informal economy in South Africa. People think that we have there's informal traders and there's lots of informal activity, but compared to similar countries around the world, we have a relatively small informal sector, and it's because so many of our sectors, which in other countries would be dominated by small producers, here they're dominated by very large producers. So all kinds of manufacturing, all kinds of retail are dominated by very large, multinational corporations. And what we've seen since 1994 is the expansion of these corporations, especially in retail, for example. Retail has expanded into townships, into rural areas, formal, large-scale retail. And so those were areas where previously, small producers and women and black people in general would have some advantage because they, live in the areas and they know the market. But with the expansion of, shopping malls and shopping centers and, big multinational corporations trading in these areas, it puts the pressure and crowds out those small producers. And so we do have this informal sector, but it's relatively small and it's very limited. It's very difficult to advance and to establish a secure base, so it makes it a very precarious sector. And we think of informal sector as being sort of inherently precarious, but there are ways to structure the market so that you can promote small producers and allow sort of economic independence. But in South Africa, we have this strength of these very large producers which crowd out that possibility. There's a lot of focus in policy on foreign traders, right? That, restricting foreign traders from certain type of activities because they seem to be outcompeting local traders. And leaving aside, that whether and how that's happening, the main barrier to development of small-scale trading is not other small-scale traders who happen to be foreigners, but it's large-scale multinational corporations. So if we want a policy that promotes small-scale trade and promotes economic independence, it has to take on that large monopolistic power of big corporations and not focus on other small-scale traders to try to, get a few more crumbs from what is available at the bottom of the market, but to really level the playing field. And that involves, antitrust and anti-monopoly type of policies, which, historically have been implemented in other places, and there's no reason they couldn't happen here, but they have been for a long time far off of our sort of agenda.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Dr. Ben Scully, for that. I think there's a lot that you've mentioned that we need to think about, that we need to take forward, that we need to change, and this is what the OZA report is actually recommending, and that we focus more on policies as well. But you mentioned informal trading, and this is where I think we'll be going to next. We'll be talking about the informal trade space and how policies can be changed there to make it better. So when we talk about decriminalizing informal mining, we have these works over here. They are by Lucas Ledwaba. He has been documenting artisanal mining for a number of years now. He's been visiting certain communities, getting the stories of the people who are part of this trade, and understanding what it means for them to make a livelihood from this, and some of the challenges that they've faced as well as informal miners or artisanal miners. And it says a lot about our history in South Africa in terms of what works at a particular point for certain big companies or multinationals, and the language that is used to sort of legitimize that versus other types of work by certain people, and that becomes delegitimized, and they are made to feel inferior, they are made to feel that the work that they're doing is illegal. So he's been documenting that. It's quite a powerful series of work as well, and we featured that here to reflect that side of the conversation.
So the work that I do at Oxfam South Africa in the Natural Resource Governance or Extractives program focuses on accountability, transparency in the mining value chain, community participation and inclusion, gender justice in the extractives value chain, and supporting and advocating for the rights of artisanal miners and small-scale miners, amongst others. In our work with communities in particular, we have supported the Right to Know campaign. We've supported communities such as the Olobeni community exercise their right to FPIC, which is not necessarily a legal instrument in South Africa as of yet, but it is considered international best practice. FPIC is free, prior, and informed consent. So in the case of a mining company wanting to come to mine in an area, they need to have consultative processes with communities and various stakeholders such as traditional leaders, and establish whether or not communities consent to mining in the areas, and what how communities can best benefit from these operations. So we have supported the Amadebe committee's advocacy for their right to say no to mining, for their right to free, prior, and informed consent. We have worked alongside networks, national networks such as Makua, who are nationally based. We've helped train activists across the country, activists such as Ulaki Chabalala, who we work with. We also have worked across the country with various communities in empowering communities with regards to having information and knowledge about policies and legal frameworks regarding mining operations in their communities. So for instance, in the Western Cape, we've worked with a coastal community in Lutzville, where we supported various activists and community members to attend regional platforms such as the Alternative Mining in Daba. We've also gone into those communities such as Lutzville, where we've trained over 200 activists on policies and legislative frameworks such as social labor plans. We have also worked with communities in KwaZulu-Natal, where communities had been dislocated or relocated by mining companies, and we've helped facilitate conversations between the various stakeholders to ensure that those people who were wrongfully moved were attended to in terms of, having new houses built for them and being compensated for the land that they had been removed from. We continue to do this work across the country.
We have here a guest who will be speaking about women's work, the role of labor policy, and how it hasn't been conducive to how women have been working. And she will introduce herself. So welcome to you, Baba. Please tell us about yourself, who you are, where you're from, the organization that you're affiliated with.
Thank you for having me, Phumzile. It's an honor. My name is Baba Tamana Qobule, but everyone calls me Baba. I'm originally, where home is Utne, Kwanabuhle, which is no surprise to the work that I do, because it's an industrial, it's a township situated along an industrial strip. So that's where my initial questions started forming around women's work in relation to the structure of the economy. I work as a senior economist at Trade and Industrial Policy Strategies, which is a research think tank or institution that is affiliated or is known to work for government. I work in the policy space in terms of research, and I have a love for looking at gender and industrial policy specifically.
So please tell us a bit more about your understanding and your perspective of policy and around women's issues, and what are the limitations that are existing?
I would say that industrial policy continues to entrench what they would call a patriarchal capitalist system, and you correctly pointed to the structure of South Africa, particularly around the MEC. And I would say that the limitations, of course, economics reflects the dominant ideology, and it's no different in industrial policy. Yes, it is, you could say on one element, it's underfunded. Industrial policy aims to restructure the economy in this current phase of our economic development. But yes, it is underfunded, but even if it is underfunded, we should be asking ourselves the questions of how or what does it mean to reconstruct the structure of the economy in ways that don't exploit women's work. And the other thing I would say is, policy tends to deal with groups of people and not the nuances of people, the way people construct their own livelihoods. So policy has yet to be able to answer or basically align to a developmental agenda which is constructed from the point of view of the livelihoods of Black women in this country. So there will be limitations just conceptually around, for example, IPAP, which has no longer been tabled, or rather not tabled, it's been put aside as we rethink what we want our industrial policy to mean or to do. But in that old iteration, you can see the sectors which are considered to be real, the sectors that therefore get funded, and that's the auto sector, predominantly gets over 60% of the industrial policy budget. And that tells you something about the way that growth is perceived first, and then there will be a trickle down. And yet women's work, even outside the labor market, is fundamental to the way in which the laborers can function, which the space is also saying. And so I think they're just conceptual ways in which we haven't really thought about social reproduction, its role in the economy. We haven't even thought about, like I'm saying, what about considering focusing where women do work, and that would be services, etc. and considering centering where women's work or the sectors where women work within the conceptualization of industrial policy in the sectors we target. So I would say, you know, as I'm saying, it's multidimensional. It's not even enough to look at women only as laborers, right? So the last point I would make is that even when women are visible to the state, domestic workers have rights now, you know, even when they are visible to the state, they tend to be exposed to various forms of economic violence. And so I think we also need to be careful of what it, you know, actually means to visibilize women but not protect them as laborers. And I would say the domestic worker issue, as much as we know we count domestic workers as a category, we never used to. I would say, you know, we need to be careful of the nuances and being able to think through from the point of view of the livelihoods of women. I mean, what is the economy for ultimately? And yeah, I would say that.
This room over here is dealing mainly with care work. So we have touched on issues that domestic workers are dealing with. We've touched on issues that mainly black women are facing in their daily lives in terms of the different forms of care work that they do, in terms of how they're actually anchoring the society that we live in, enabling our society to reproduce themselves on a daily basis. Over here, we have our first work, which is called Singalibali Kuba Sizalwa Ngubani, and it is a work that is reflecting just what I've mentioned, the different ways in which black women particularly are overstretched, whether they are healthcare workers, whether they are heading their households, whether they are doing a lot of work within rural areas or rural communities. And it really speaks to the intersectionality of inequality as well, and unpaid care work, and how it hasn't been recognized really by government, how it hasn't been recognized by policymakers in terms of how much it contributes, how much black women, how much women contribute towards upholding society and making it easier for people to actually live their lives, to go to work, to run companies. So I think it's a powerful work as well. Also drawn some quotes from the report, which tell us a bit more about gendered economic roles and how they contribute to universal and long-lasting occupational segregation. So we still see how inequality persists in terms of how economic roles continue to be gendered. And there has to be a lot of change that comes about with that. But this is the type of work that Oxfam, as well as other social justice movements, are working towards. What we see in this space here is a work by Thandiwe Shabalala. It's called Strapped South African Black Well-Organized Women Essentials. So this is a work that she did back in 2014, if I'm not mistaken, and it was actually a graphic that she did as a sort of response to a situation she was experiencing at the time. She is a black woman, she is an illustrator, and she found herself so frustrated just one day thinking about how she wasn't able to actually get to what she needed to do because she couldn't afford certain things. So this particular work touches on income inequality specifically, which is as a result of social inequality. So a lot of women find themselves having to actually be the breadwinner in the home, for instance. They find themselves having to do a lot of care work, but yet they're facing challenges which aren't seen behind the scenes, so to speak. They cannot afford toilet paper, for instance. Some women cannot afford shampoo. Some women can't afford dental floss, as she illustrates here. So they are forced to improvise or to reuse certain things a number of times. And it doesn't only end with products, but we've seen a lot of people, not just women, dealing with having to reuse, for instance, resources such as water a number of times just due to a lack of access to certain basic necessities. This space over here is a sound installation called the Made series. So the title was also How Heroines Are Made. That's what really drew me to the work. It's actually a podcast by Lilian as well as Utuliza Cindy. And they were hosting this show on Cliff Central a few years ago. And what they would do is they would actually invite domestic workers to be part of various conversations that they had about the work that they do. They raised a lot of important issues which they felt they couldn't really express on other platforms, which I found quite interesting, and I thought it was an important part to have as part of this conversation, since we are talking about domestic work as well. A lot of women who are doing a lot of care work in various homes. So it's quite an interesting sound installation. You can have a listen.
I like to be called Langa. I prefer that because the domestic maid cleaner is a very strong word and it doesn't feel right. Even where I come from, they ask me what job I'm doing. Obviously, you can't lie to them. You tell them mostly it's the kitchens. They ask us, "Nisebenza kuphi?" Ema kitchen. They know what you do in the kitchens. But sometimes you feel embarrassed to tell them what you're doing because that's not what you really wanted to become.
I mean, this is really interesting to me, and it brings up this other question about how you guys got into this kind of work. Maybe you can just discuss that a little bit with us.
I think for myself, it was like an accident or something I was put into it. That wasn't my dream. When I was like at school, I always dreamed like, when I finish school, I would like to work as a medical aid or a nurse in the medical department or in the police force. Those were the two things I wanted to do. But like if you come from a poor background, sometimes parents don't have enough money to put you up to do those courses. Then, my aunt then just decided that I should do this domestic work. Just for a few months or what, but that was the beginning of it until now.
This work over here by Merisibande is called They Don't Make Them Like They Used To, and it is part of this exhibition courtesy of her gallery, Smack Gallery, as well as her, Merisibande, thank you very much. A lot of her work centers around just speaking about the issues that women face, but more specifically domestic workers. So she has this figure called Sophie that she's been developing over a number of years. It gained a lot of prominence from 2009. And she modeled it around her own grandmother's experience as a former domestic worker. And she created these beautiful statues that were really just honoring her grandmother's work and the work that she did in terms of being able to raise a family on that domestic worker's salary, and despite the challenges that she may have been facing even at work. But it's really a testament to the power of the imagination. I was drawn to it particularly because of the Superman sign there that she sewed onto what she's sewing there, the figure is sewing there. So I think it's quite powerful there. And I think it's a true reflection of the superhero role that a lot of women face, especially domestic workers, who often do a lot of work that goes unthanked quite often. This space over here is dedicated to the Care for Carers campaign, which is an initiative that is led by Oxfam South Africa, as well as some of their allies, such as the Young Nurses in the Indaba Trade Union, as well as other healthcare workers organizations. It's really ensuring that healthcare workers receive the care that they also need in order to be able to care for others, but also making sure that the organizations that are profiting from this sector recognize that and that people are put before profits. I think that's an important message that came through, particularly from the workers who actually have been protesting during COVID-19, the pandemic that's been going on, and they've been challenging the various stakeholders, such as the private sector, challenging them to say their needs need to be taken care of as well in order for them to be able to take care of people who are ill. So even though they are frontline workers, it's important to consider them as people first before anything else. We've actually used some of the posters that they were using in the protest. We've used some of the items that they actually used to stage this protest in front of one of the private hospitals. So what we wanted to depict here is actually the different types of care work that many black women face in South Africa that they do. So for example here, this shows that 4 out of every 10 black women in South Africa are heading households. Over there, we see our woman outstretched, showing a symbol referring to healthcare workers such as yourself. And over here, we show the different types of work that they are doing as well, especially in the rural areas. And there at the top, we're showing the intersectionality of inequality as well as unpaid care work. So as a healthcare worker, how do you see yourself represented in a piece like this? What does it mean to you to be outstretched in so many ways as a healthcare worker? Can you just tell us a bit more about that?
Okay. As a care worker, I think it's a calling, because when you work with patients, you must go extra miles ukuthi uncede abantu, because if it's a calling, I think you'll do it from deep down from your heart. As a woman, a black woman, we are working very hard, and it's so painful when we see our people dying in front of our eyes, trying to help them. But some other times it's difficult because some of the other people, they don't want to take treatment. They take it as it's a play. If usinikele njengomuntu omnyama owumama, sisebenza kanzima, we are working very hard. We make sure that our people, they adhere to what we are trying to tell them. You see, we are stretching our hands, whereby we don't even reach where we want to reach. During COVID-19, there were many problems. We ran short of PPEs. PPEs were just located for the nurses and the doctors. We as care workers, we've been given cloth mask, and only one cloth mask. And according to my understanding, you must wear a cloth mask for a day. So they give us one cloth mask for the whole week. You see, it was a very big challenge, because this COVID-19, nobody knew about it, because if you can see, even at the parliament, it was too much. They didn't give us the material to work with. And you see at the private hospitals, they treated our people very bad. You see, we care workers, we were given only these aprons and those clothes masks only. We didn't have gloves. We didn't have the surgical masks. The surgical masks, they said they're only going to give to the doctors and the nurses. All this stuff, we were running short of them. So what we were going to protest there, we wanted them to put people before the profit. How am I going to work without wearing this, knowing that I'm going to work for COVID? Am I going to work without wearing these proper PPEs? No, the only thing that they care about is just to care about money. They work for money. They don't care about people. And we only care about these people, because without these people, there was not going to be food in my table. I don't have time to spend with my children, because of I'm willing to work with my whole heart. But look at our colleagues. Look at our colleagues. Look, where did they end? They end up dying, going to graves, because we wanted to help patients. But we as the care workers, nobody who cares about us. I'm very sorry about that. The COVID-19 have changed our lives. Everything by the COVID-19, it is changed. But since from the day one, we were working there. Whether we like it or not, we are afraid or not. But look at our colleagues today, where they are lying.
So I think the big message is put people before
First.
profits,
Yes,
right? Put
yes.
people first before profits. I think
Yes.
that's the big message here. Thank you so much for all of that, for giving us more context, better understanding, more insight into everything. It's heartbreaking, really, but we hope that with this messaging, with your insight, your valuable input into this, we'll get more change actually happening. This room is dedicated towards understanding wealth inequality, but more structural inequality than anything. What has enabled wealth inequality to continue? What has enabled the wealth gap to keep widening? And so we start off here in the room by seeing the faces of our presidents from 1994 up until presently. And they are placed here because they're really gatekeepers to the wealth that exists. And part of that is because of the decisions that they made in terms of policy making. We've seen neoliberalism as a big theme within this exhibition, and the report mentions that as well in terms of the decisions that they made that put profits before people when the transition was made from the apartheid government to the new political dispensation.
So first, the major political source of corruption, bracketing off the economy for the moment, is that politicians have unchecked powers of appointment, promotion, and dismissal. There's some philosophical background here. The theory of modern government is skeptical of the motives of people who govern. Certainly, there are good people in government, but the problem is that we can't be sure about this. So the theory of modern government invented the notion of checks and balances to cover for this. Checks and balances work by setting offices up in such a way that they are controlled by different people with different interests, but where each is reliant on the other to achieve their goals. What that means is that each has an interest in checking and balancing the other. We're all familiar with the notion of divide and rule. Well, checks and balances are how the people divide and rule the government. We tend to think of checks and balances at the level of the overarching constitution, for instance, as checks and balances between the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. Within the executive, however, the public administration itself contains an elaborate system of checks and balances. Most important administrative processes are divided up into stages, with different people controlling each stage, so that no single person or group can control the whole process and corrupt it. Known as the segregation of duties, when corruption happens in South Africa, it usually starts with the politician using powers of suspension and appointment to place people across the stages of such a process, bridging the segregation of duties, cross-cutting checks and balances. The main reason why this happens is that the Public Service Act, the Municipal Systems Act, and the various pieces of legislation regulating public entities got rid of the key checks and balances and personnel processes, so politicians can now basically appoint, promote, and suspend largely as they see fit. South Africans tend to think that this is normal, but it isn't. In many countries, personnel processes are checked and balanced by independent civil service bodies like the Public Service Commission, by processes within the public service itself, and so on. Countries that don't have such mechanisms, like South Africa, tend to have much higher levels of corruption than countries that do. That's the first point. The second point is that corruption thrives in conditions of poverty and inequality. Where checks and balances aren't working, then we must rely on electoral accountability to stop corruption. Where there's high levels of poverty and inequality, however, that means that there's large numbers of people who are marginalized not only from the economic, but also from the civic and political life of a country. They often lack the resources and status to organize and engage as effectively as they could in the work of electoral accountability. Moreover, where politicians have corrupted government, they can also make access to state-distributed resources dependent on showing political support. Where popular opposition emerges, corrupt politicians can buy off popular leaders with jobs, contracts, and other benefits drawn from the state. In this way, they can divide and rule popular movements. Poor people, who rely more heavily on state distributions, are especially vulnerable to this sort of move. This leads me to my third point, which is that corruption works to entrench poverty and inequality. There's an argument doing the rounds in South Africa that corruption is a result of class formation, that it creates channels of upward mobility in politics for poor people. On this view, corruption reduces inequality. Certainly, some people upwardly mobilize through politics, but unfortunately, the vast majority don't, and politicians have no interest in facilitating that. Rather, politicians tend to prefer to create large numbers of small benefits. They create part-time and below minimum wage jobs, like in the expanded public works program. They split up contracts, making them smaller and shorter term, so they can continuously allocate and reallocate to larger and larger numbers of people. They do so in a way that is calculated to ensure political support, to head off popular threats to their rule. Corruption, in other words, is a way to govern poverty and inequality, and the patronage networks that it forms tend to trap people in low-paying and uncertain occupations, subject to political opportunists with little real opportunity for upward mobility. Moreover, corruption tends to undermine the functioning of administrations that are needed to facilitate broader-based and more sustained development. So, how do we resolve the corruption problem in South Africa? Well, there are two technically simple ways that are politically very complicated. We need to start empowering the Public Service Commission to manage appointments to the higher levels of key departments. We need to turn these administrations towards state-led development and redistribution that is rights-based, impersonal, and free of political opportunists.
In the room entitled Deeds, there are a number of elements that we use to try and capture what or how the structure of our economy functions such that economic and gender inequality is produced. Now, I'm not going to go through all of these elements. You have to come watch and see the exhibition yourself. However, I am going to talk about a few of these elements. First, I must say that the inspiration of this, of Entitled Deeds, comes from the sense or the feeling that many of our wealthy tycoons have, which is that they can, amass this great wealth, right? As in how they do through outsourcing, casualization, some of the things that we've spoken about, expropriation, all that stuff. And then do their little side hustle where they use some of that money towards philanthropy to do some good deeds, right? To the economies that they are actually impoverishing because of their privilege, right? So part of their entitlement comes from their ability to do that. And one example of that is Johann Rupert, who gave away some title deeds to a community in Stellenbosch, a township community in Stellenbosch. The whole question here is that given that you amass your wealth in these ways that we speak about, is that that title deed, is that really transformative, right? Are you really doing your best to mind your privilege and to redistribute your privilege to those who would need support and a fair start in life? So this is really a spin on that. So as you enter the room, you are met by a boom gate that has the faces of both current and past presidents. And then also there's a security guard that's there, that's dressed in some retail security guard almost outfit. What is very important to note about this retail company is that they have the largest pay gap in the country, such that the gap between the highest paid employee and the lowest paid employee is like 1,000 times over, right? In terms of the wage gap there. So anyways, you're met by these characters, right? And what that boom gate represents, I mean, you're already thinking, okay, we are in an estate, some kind of gated community. And that boom gate basically represents the amount of protection that government through macroeconomic policy has actually afforded these wealthy elites, right? And so as you enter the room and go past the boom gate, then you see a couple watching TV. And the movie that they're watching is Pretty Woman. And I must say that the couple that is a mixed race couple. So they're watching this movie, Pretty Woman, which is of course a very famous movie. Many of you have probably seen it. And we use this movie as a way of explaining what financialization is, because it actually does very well to explain what this phenomena is, although we only see the Cinderella type storyline, but there's more to it than that.
Who of you have heard of the movie Pretty Woman? What is Pretty Woman about?
Pretty Woman is on the surface a Cinderella story about an investment banker who pays for the services of a sex worker to keep him company while he's away on a business trip. After a week of spending time together, which includes shopping sprees, a night out at the opera, being sexually harassed by the investment banker's lawyer, and almost breaking up, they end up falling in love, and we are led to believe living happily ever after. What if I told you that there is more to the story of Pretty Woman than what we think? A side of Pretty Woman that is often missed is its story of financialization in the late 1980s. This is a story of financialization told through the lens of Pretty Woman. What is financialization, you may ask? In the following clip, where Vivian and Edward are having breakfast, we learn about some of the key features of financialization. Vivian's character acts as our consciousness as she asks Edward about what financialization is. These are some of the things that we find out.
I was working last night.
You don't sleep, you don't do drugs, you don't drink, you hardly eat. What do you do, Edward? Because I know you're not a lawyer.
That's right. There are 4 other chairs here.
Oh. So what do you do?
I buy companies.
What kind of companies?
I buy companies that are in financial difficulty.
If they have problems, you must get them for a bargain, huh?
Well, the company I'm buying this week, I'm getting for the bargain price of about $1 billion.
$1 billion?
Yes.
Wow. You must be really smart, huh? I only got through 11th grade. How far did you go in school?
I went all the way.
Your folks must be really proud, huh? So you don't actually have $1 billion, huh?
No, I get some of it from banks, investors. It's not an easy thing to do.
And you don't make anything?
No.
And you don't build anything?
No.
So what do you do with the companies once you buy them?
I sell them.
Here, let me do that. You sell them.
Well, I don't sell the whole company. I break it up into pieces, and then I sell that off. It's worth more than the whole.
So it's sort of like stealing cars and selling them for the parts, right?
Yeah, sort of, but legal.
1. It involves financial actors, markets, and institutions. Edward, an investment banker, uses his skills to borrow money to the value of $1 billion from lenders that include commercial banks, pension funds, and insurance companies. This act of borrowing is known as raising or mobilizing finance. 2, it involves financial engineering or the use of maths to develop a financial product that can be bought or sold for profits. Although not discussed in this clip, an investor such as Edward could raise the finance he needs by selling junk bonds to lenders in exchange for the loan to the value of $1 billion. A junk bond is an IOU, which promises to make a lot more money for the lender than what they lend. But it is a very risky bond because there is a high chance that the borrower, in this case Edward, may default or not pay back what he owes the lender. 3, financialization involves financial motives. In this example, the goal for mobilizing this finance is not to invest in the long-term activities of the firm, example, buying machinery and equipment in order to gain profits by building or making more goods and services better. The goal for mobilizing this finance is to make quick profits by betting on the value of a thing. In this case, the value of the company, once it's been bought, broken into smaller pieces, and each one has been sold off in order to extract its value in a lot of cash. 5, Vivian makes 2 important observations about what Edward does. You don't make anything. You don't build anything. And what you do, it's like stealing cars and selling them for the parts, right? To which Edward responds, it's all legal. People like Edward, that is, investment bankers, started to grow in numbers when the illegal things that they were doing to make money started to become legal. They took advantage of loose restrictions on the way that money markets, pension funds, insurance funds, and commercial banks can invest money. Pension funds and commercial banks could now start investing in risky IOUs like junk bonds, which opened up people like Edward to a lot of loan money that they could play with to steal cars and sell them for the parts. 5. Therefore, these financial motives, actors, institutions, financial markets have an impact on how well economies do. The impact of financialization on economies is best captured in the next clip. Here we see Edward, Vivian, Mr. Lewis, and his grandson David at dinner at the Voltaire. In the exchange between Mr. Lewis and Edward, we see a tension in their view of the role of a firm in the economy.
Mr. Lewis, my grandfather believes the men who create a company should control its destiny.
Where's the salad?
The salad comes at the end of the meal.
That's the fork I knew.
Let me put it another way. Between your public statements and the rumors flying around on this thing, we find it very hard to figure out what your real intentions are.
I don't know about you, but I've never been able to figure which goes with what.
You know, there was a time when we built ships the size of cities. Men like my grandfather made this country.
Who ordered this?
The gentleman did, ma'am. Bon appetit.
These are escargot. It's French for snails. It's a delicacy. Try it. David?
Mr. Lewis, if you were to get control, and I don't think you will, but if you did, what do you plan to do with the company?
Break it up and sell off the pieces?
I'm sure you understand I'm not thrilled at the idea of your turning 40 years of my work into your garage sale.
At the price I'm paying for this stock, Mr. Morse, you are going to be a very rich man.
I'm rich enough. I just want to head my shipyard.
Financialization, seen through Edward's eyes, has redefined economic activity and the firm. A firm is no longer seen through Mr. Lewis' eyes as an institution made up of people, resources, and processes that combine to make things that are then bought in exchange for more money. Through Edward's eyes, a firm is just a stock or a share that can be traded or exchanged for more money. Therefore, financialization worsens the big separation that is already present between the workers of the firm and the things that they are contracted to produce, because the purpose of the firm, as seen through Edward's eyes, is just to maximize as much value or profit for the shareholders. While financialization can be good for shareholders and investment bankers like Edward because they earn lots of money, financialization is not good for workers, the unemployed, and the economy at large, because the economy is turned into one big garage sale. Workers lose their jobs, firms are bought and sold just for a quick buck, and there is little long-term investment in companies that will employ people and grow the economy. This results in low economic growth and high unemployment. In South Africa, we also started to relax our laws and policies that govern financial markets. We made it easier for money to move around so that people like Edward could shift their money from South Africa to America and back to South Africa again in a week. We thought by relaxing our laws governing these markets, we would be able to attract people who are more like Mr. Lewis, that invest over the long term, building companies that will grow and employ people. Instead, we got people like Edward, who were just interested in hit-and-run investments investing in the South African economy in the short term, and then pulling out. We got many people like Edward because they were attracted to our high interest rates thanks to policies like inflation targeting, which they could use to make lots of money. How they did that is a story for another day. However, people like Mr. Lewis, in an environment of high interest rates, could not survive because their borrowing costs were so high, and banks stopped investing in them and began to invest like Edward. Therefore, companies owned by the likes of Mr. Lewis started to shut down, or they began to act like Edward in order to make quick bucks. For instance, they could use financial engineering to dodge paying taxes by moving money into tax havens like Panama. This is what Steenhoff did. Or they can use financial engineering to dodge paying workers their wages. This was also made worse because they had to compete with products coming in from other countries. The winners of this financialization are the investors, the speculators, the top 1% or 10% of economies around the world. The losers are businesses that are built to last, businesses that have a long-term horizon and not quick money and speculation. The losers are workers, the unemployed, society at large. That's the story of financialization told through the eyes of pretty women. Oxfam South Africa's report calls on the South African government to do the right thing for an inclusive economy, free from financialization. This means 1. A macroeconomic policy targeting full employment and not inflation targeting. 2. Controls are put in place to limit harmful hit-and-run investments. 3. A financial sector geared towards long-term productive investments. This should be done through regulation, such as the separation between commercial and investment banking. 4. State-led development of a large green industrial development bank that finances productive activities at different scales.
So I think what is key here is that our economy looks more like Edward's vision of the economy. It looks more like a garage sale, thanks to financialization, right? I think there was someone in a workshop that called it the mashonisa economy. That's a good way of perhaps conceptualizing or thinking about financialization. Now, what's important to note is that the likes of Edward have amassed their wealth, or even this mixed race couple have amassed their wealth through macroeconomic policies that have supported financialization, or this mashonisa economy, right, post-1994. And what is important is that it's not only governments, but like our government, but this is actually a global architecture. The global system works in this way. And so you are met as you enter the room next to the bed by a lampshade. And the tassels of this lampshade are written World Bank, International Monetary Fund, Moody's, Fitch, and the rest. And these are international financial institutions that have been very key in giving us enlightenment, in enlightening us on how the economy and how economies around the world should be designed and should function. What they've actually done is ensure that this macroeconomic framework that supports financialization is implemented across countries, right, by force. Whereas, our country actually, they quite embraced and accepted or at least the ruling elite at that time embraced and accepted this kind of framework. And this enlightenment is called the Washington Consensus, because many of these institutions that I'm speaking of are actually based in Washington, where this doctrine kind of emerges. So what is key here is that our capitalist couple, mixed race couple, are supported by these types of institutions, the fact that they can amass their wealth in the way in which they do because of this Washington Consensus, which is the enlightenment through which our macroeconomic policy is framed. It's also important to highlight is that, these tycoons, once they amass their money, they can spend it in various ways they want, right? They buy private jets, they go on holiday, and in fact, what you see is a picture on the wall, a holiday destination, which is an island called Panama. Now, what is significant about Panama is that it's not just a leisure island, right? Panama is a tax haven. This is where the rich use financial engineering tricks to not pay taxes where they would have accumulated their wealth. So in South Africa, they probably don't pay taxes, and they'll decide, actually, we know that the tax rate is 28, the corporate tax is 28%, but we'll make sure that we pay 11%. So what ends up happening is that workers aren't paid the amount of money that they are meant to be paid, because they will make it as though the business is not doing well to pay wages through financial engineering, and then they will ship their money off, and we won't be able to get money to where it is needed, such as in education, in healthcare, in roads, in water and sanitation, and then they put their money up in Panama. So that for us is quite key, so that these types of links are made. Perhaps the most controversial part of the scene is this mixed race couple. As you will remember or recall, there's a lot of collaboration that happens to set up the system. There's the collaboration between the state and capital. There's the collaboration between business, IFIs, the government, and all these collaborations that happen to maintain the status quo, right? Now, there's also the collaboration, obviously, within business itself. And the way in which that has happened in this country is through Black economic empowerment. So that couple basically is representative of that. And it asks us a very key question, which is, has this been really transformative? Because you see that the Black business person is also enjoying the spoils of wealth, right, by using the same similar mechanisms, right, to that others use, right, whether it is outsourcing, casualization, financial engineering, and all that stuff.
So in this space over here, we're looking at the informal sector, informal trading, and we represented that through photography, which we have over here, and we're really looking at the role of retailers or even multinationals and how they are impacting how informal traders are working. So something that we usually think of when we think of informal traders is usually from the lens of police brutality, but what we don't usually do is consider the role of corporates.
For me, the informal sector is huge, and yet people look down at the informal sector being a small entity, and they don't take people very seriously, especially people on the ground, because they're poor and they're fending for themselves. As we are now in COVID-19, we can see that it has a huge impact on them, because now we've got more people coming because they are unemployed. So that is going to bring the numbers even bigger. And the challenge is huge, because people don't have money at the moment, even to buy from the informal traders. So our issue is huge, as people think it's just a nothings, but we are feeling the impact, because we can see business is down. there's no money. People don't have money to buy things anymore. So we're feeling it. It's harsh. And then also with the 350 rand, we thought we could stay at home. But unfortunately, we're fending now for our families to come back to work. During COVID, which we were supposed to be having social distancing, which we see that social distancing, especially in a taxi rank, you can't call a taxi rank, an overcrowded taxi rank, and still have a social distancing. What are you talking about? We are crowded in a taxi rank, never mind or the impact of us getting into the taxi with 100% people, 100% full, and there's no social distancing. So we as informal traders, we are heavily impacted because we're trying very hard to put food on the table, nevertheless trying to transport ourselves without having any money. There's no train system. The train system is in tatters. We see people are actually now living informally on the online. They're living online on the rails. So you can see our situation is getting dire. So for me, I don't know, our challenges are huge.
Okay, so maybe just tell us a bit more about whether you are consulted or not when decisions are made regarding the informal sector.
Participation is very poor. Not only do they not call the public, they do not even call the relevant stakeholders, which are the organization that represent the informal traders that would know where the issues are, like for instance service delivery, issues with the office, issue with the illegal issues with traders not being registered or rather being put on a database. That is our challenges we have on a daily basis because people are not sure who they must go to, who they must see to. They always look up to the representatives, but our hands are very short. We can't even go into those things because the city officials are the ones that are in charge. They hardly come to the office. They come maybe I think once in a while to the office. They run 2 markets at the same time. I don't know how can an administrator or manager run an office at the same time while he's supposed to be in one market. So the thing is, there's always this blame game. Then the traders are not sure what's going on and they become very livid, and sometimes they even take it out on us as representatives that we are not doing enough. But the challenges are huge because we are never consulted over anything. Even if there's any decision making, we're never part of it. We are always alienated. And when it comes to the service delivery issues, when it comes to when they're structuring the thing, they never get to us and tell us what are we going to construct or what we're going to do. They just come up with upgrades and then they put this on to us without us knowing what's going to happen really. The scope of work is never given to us. We never see it. They do everything behind closed doors. So obviously the public is going to have an outcry because they're not participating in these meetings. Things are always done in their own way. And for us as representing the traders, although we are supposed to be there, we are not there. We're not part of decision making. And we're not saying that we want to do everything, but at least call us and tell us, is this needed? Is this not needed? What should be done? And so that the traders are, that they are, although we know they can't keep making us all happy at the same time because we will have illegals all the time. But for me is, what happens to the database? Because they are in charge of the database, not us. Even when they do demarcation, it gets done through the DED and the Johannesburg Property Company. So, not Johannesburg Property Company, DED and the other organization, the JMPD. They are responsible for demarcation. So we have to rely on the Department of Economic Development for all those things. So even if we want things to be demarcated, we can't get it done because we have to go through so many challenges. And for us, we can't really speak to the officials because they follow orders. They don't follow us. We are just, how can I say, we are ignored all the time. We are not consulted. The only time they hear us is when we start doing the toy, and then they see us, we really mean business. But for the moment, the informal sector has been ignored.
So what are some of the solutions that you'd like to suggest? What can you recommend? What would you like to see actually happening differently in the informal sector?
Well, firstly, because we are in a space where public is walking around and we are with the taxis, we have very little space. We don't even know sometimes where we must even walk because our places are so small. Right now, they are going to build the taxi range. There's a new project coming up. And it's still going to be, they're still using the small space. For me, I'm trying to figure out if they are going to restructure the taxi range on a single space where it stands at the moment. How is it possible that they're going to provide all those things for the other traders? That means traders are still going to be outside. Millions of rand has been spent, and we never see the scope of work. This is what I'm saying. So we want accountability and transparency, and they must do it now. We don't want to hear anything about this or that. We want accountability, because 75 million rand is a lot of money.
But playing such an important role in contributing to the,
and the
to this
economy, and especially taking care of mothers taking care of their children and educating their kids with this very same money and looking after their family. This is most vital for any informal trader. It's their livelihood. This is all they have. They are unemployed, and more unemployment is still there. More people are going to come into the informal economy. So people can't say it's a small little thing. It's huge.
Over here, we have a work by Tommy Mutswai, and this is courtesy of him, Tommy Mutswai, as well as his daughter Joyce Mutswai and Dalro. So they gave us copyright permission to use this particular work. And he did this piece back in 1985 during the state of the emergency in South Africa. And it was a reflection really on how retail giants have been just regarded as so important, rather than what's happening around the world or around the country at the time. So people were more interested in just going shopping and going about their usual lives. And the piece is titled "Okay is Everything," actually, and we included it here because it's again just speaks to this looming role of the retail giants in this country, and how people just keep going on about their daily lives or daily existence, but don't realize how much of an important role that they've been playing in entrenching inequality still. So we put this here alongside these works called forced removals. Again, this whole installation is forced removals. So what we've seen here are retail giants such as ShopRite Checkers, as well as Pick n Pay, for instance, and they have gone about and bought a lot of spaza shops that have existed in particularly township areas, and they have rebranded them according to their own brands. But in the process, what they've done is they've made it difficult for informal traders to operate efficiently. They've made it more difficult, increasingly difficult, for informal traders to make a living. And these images depict that, and we found it quite powerful in that they show particularly people just going to buy at the now branded USave store, for instance, and an informal trader working outside. In another image, we see at the Jabulani Mall in Soweto, we have informal traders who were pushed out while the mall was actually being created, and no space was created for them to work. They didn't have ablution facilities, for instance, but one of our speakers will speak more to that. And yes, we just found it very interesting to show the two sides of the coin that exist in terms of this type of inequality and entrenching inequality here. Over here, we have just a work showing or depicting the retailers who are in a winning position in this check-out part of our check-in, check-out installation. And what we'd like as well is for our visitors to the exhibition to contribute solutions that could make a difference in terms of how we deal with inequality, in terms of challenging policies that exist. So we'd like people to contribute that and share those with us over here in this space. And to wrap up the whole exhibition, OZA came up with a number of recommendations, which you can find in the report, in terms of solutions that can actually be taken in response to all of the problems that have been pointed out. So these are some of the positives that we can take going forward, or these are some of the changes that we can make. For example, a living wage and a cap on minimum income, implement a package of progressive macroeconomic policies, for instance, fiscal tax justice, tackling political and corporate capture, gender accountable and just budgeting and planning, recognize, reduce, redistribute unpaid work and care workers to be represented in policy decision making, implement industrial policies that prioritize the creation of more and better jobs for women, enforce labor protections for democratic and fair workspaces, reverse labor reforms that attack working class organizing, protections, fair, safe access to markets for informal sector, and universal basic income grant. So these are powerful recommendations by Oxfam South Africa, and they can be found in the report. And as a social justice consultancy, I think that they've come up with some powerful ways of tackling all of the issues that we've highlighted throughout this exhibition. And I do hope that the relevant people take note of that, and that going forward that some of this is implemented, if not all of it is implemented. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. We do hope that you enjoyed the show. Thank you to Oxfam South Africa. Thank you to the Workers Museum. Thank you to all of our participating artists, our exhibiting artists. Thank you to the team that helped us put everything together. Thank you to the speakers who were here to join us today. And we do hope that you learned a lot more about the different types of inequality, the intersectionality of inequality that exists, and that we do hope that the artworks were a true reflection of the work that the Oxfam South Africa report is doing to raise awareness about this inequality. So we do hope to see you soon, but otherwise please do follow Oxfam South Africa on their various social network platforms. And thank you very much. My name is Phumzile Nombuso Twala. Thank you.